David Viens was a decorated chef. He was known for his incredible cooking, with his restaurant becoming the go-to spot for all the foodie people who were looking for more than just a meal. It was an experience. According to his customers, his dishes weren't just food. They were like pieces of art, and he made sure everyone who came through his door left feeling satisfied. And his wife, Dawn, was the kind of person who lit up a room, super friendly and loved by everyone who met her. You could tell the two of them had a good thing going. They had a loving relationship that anyone could see was the real deal. But then, on October 18, 2009, something strange happened. Dawn suddenly went missing. No one knew where she went, and David, when asked about it, said he had just fired her. That seemed odd, especially since no one had seen her since. Over time, people started to wonder if David had something to do with her disappearance. Months later, things took a wild turn. David was approached by Sergeant Garcia from the LA County Sheriff's Homicide Division, and his reaction was pretty shocking. When he heard who the officer was, David went pale, clearly caught off guard. He barely said anything before quickly adding, "I don't want to talk about it here. We need to leave," and kept apologizing. At one point, he was even seen speeding away from the cops in a high-speed chase. The police were hot on his tail, but David made a sharp turn near Point Vicente, pulling into a parking lot. He jumped out of the car and started running, but officers were right behind him. The chase led toward the edge of a cliff, and then things got really weird. David started stripping off his clothes, but no one knows why. One of the officers finally caught up to him and grabbed his pants, but David pushed him away. David reached the cliff's railing, and despite the officer trying to stop him, he climbed over it. The officer desperately followed him over, begging him not to jump. Meanwhile, David kissed his new girlfriend, shoved the officer away, and then, without warning, jumped into the abyss, disappearing. But at the suddenness of everything, the officers were totally stunned and yanked David's girlfriend back from the edge of the cliff. But why did David end his own life? What happened to his wife, Dawn? Is David connected to it? How come he already had a new girlfriend so soon? You see, questions are many, and answers we have to find out. David Viens was a larger-than-life chef and businessman. The guy had a magnetic personality and a passion for food that was impossible to miss. Family Sunday dinners at his place were legendary. In the early 90s, after going through a divorce and having 3 kids, David met Dawn, a waitress at the same restaurant. Even though he was dealing with some tough personal stuff, he stayed focused on his kids, and they'd spend a lot of quality time together. In 1997, David and Dawn tied the knot and, over the next few years, moved around before settling in Lomita, California, in 2008. Lomita, a sleepy little suburb just outside Los Angeles, was known for being quiet and crime-free. But underneath that calm surface, things about the Viens family were starting to unravel. Joe Cacace, a businessman who owned a motorcycle repair shop near David's restaurant, got to know the family over time. Surprisingly, as time passed, Dawn started confiding in Joe about her issues with David, especially how controlling he was. David, on the other hand, opened up to Joe about Dawn's drinking. David's youngest daughter, Jacqueline, aka Jackie, also saw the tension at home, remembering how she'd catch Dawn drinking early in the morning, hiding cans of beer so David wouldn't find out. Jackie always thought her mom wasn't exactly unhappy, but more like she was just completely lost in her life. She figured Dawn was kind of letting David take charge, which left her feeling stuck in a mess she didn't know how to get out of. But there was some evidence that Dawn was trying to break free a bit. Before she disappeared, Dawn had asked Joe to hold on to some money for her. Almost $700 was tucked away in his safe. Then on October 18, 2009, Dawn called Joe up and told him to add another $1,000 to that stash, saying she'd come by to drop it off the following Monday. That Monday, though, Dawn didn't show up for work or stop by Joe's, even though her car was still parked out front. Cacace, who hung out at the cafe regularly, was keeping an eye out from the rear window of his shop. He saw Dawn's car but never spotted her. A few days later, the cops started asking around about where Dawn had gone, and David said she'd left him after he pushed her to get help for her drinking. The cops weren't buying it, though. They had seen David hanging around his restaurant all the time, and they knew Dawn was a regular at Joe's, so it didn't add up. Plus, David also never reported her disappearance to the police, so something about David's story felt off. As they kept looking into it, the cops noticed something strange. Kathy Galvan, a 22-year-old waitress at the cafe, was holding hands with David. It looked like they were more than just friends now. Later, Kathy admitted she'd caught feelings for David after spending so much time around him. Someone even mentioned how Kathy was young enough to be David's daughter, and the timing of her getting close to him right after Dawn disappeared seemed pretty suspicious. But Kathy denied anything shady, insisting that they hadn't been involved before Dawn went missing. However, things got even weirder when the cops saw Kathy and David's daughter, Jackie, throwing a bunch of clothes into a dumpster behind the restaurant. What's even more striking is that the cops recognized the clothes as Dawn's. Kathy later said she was just jealous, worried David might take Dawn back, so she tossed out all of Dawn's things to get back at her. So it all started to look like more than just a coincidence. Being suspicious, the police let Dawn's sister Dana know, and she went ahead and filed a missing persons report. That report caught the eye of Larry Altman, a reporter, who decided to look into it. When he first sat down with Viens, the guy stuck to his story. He said Dawn had gotten into a fight and stormed out, grabbing her Louis Vuitton bag, but leaving everything else behind. But Altman thought it was a bit weird. Why would she leave her car behind? When Altman asked Viens if he loved Dawn and wanted her back, Viens answered in the past tense, saying he loved her and hoped she was safe. That definitely didn't sit right with Altman. As Altman dug more into Viens' past, he found out some more unsettling things. Turns out Viens wasn't just some talented chef. He was deep into the marijuana trade. Before 2009, he and Dawn had lived on Anna Maria Island in Florida, where Viens ran a restaurant and also managed a pretty big marijuana operation, moving hundreds of pounds of weed to smaller dealers. David was more focused on his illegal dealings instead of the restaurant. And if that wasn't enough, Viens had been busted in 2005 for marijuana trafficking and had a history with cocaine distribution in Vermont back in '93. That definitely didn't help his case, and still it made some impression about David. But here's the kicker. Viens wasn't exactly a stranger to working with the cops. Back in Florida, he had helped out with drug investigations and was known for being reliable, always returning calls and showing up when he was supposed to. After he got out of a year-long prison stint in 2008, he and Dawn moved to Lomita, California, and settled down quietly, at least until she vanished in the fall of 2009. When Dawn disappeared, Viens told his daughter, Jackie, that they'd had a fight and she just left. But Jackie noticed something off. There was a new woman in the picture, Kathy Galvin, with whom her father David was getting romantically involved. Jackie, after putting the pieces together, finally confronted her dad. And he straight up admitted to killing Dawn, but this time he claimed it was an accident. But that wasn't the end of it. He then turned to Jackie and asked her to help him cover everything up, even asking her to send fake texts from Dawn's phone to her friends. The weird part? Some of those texts had this bizarre misspelling of Dawn's nickname, which raised all sorts of red flags about whether the messages were real. Fast forward 16 months after Dawn vanished, and the case got bumped up to the homicide squad, with Detective Richard Garcia taking the lead. Garcia was sure David Viens was behind it, but he couldn't nail him down without solid evidence. So they decided to tap Viens' phone and even got the local newspaper involved. Those guys had been all over the case from the start. Finally, things really started to heat up when blood was found in the house Viens had shared with Dawn. It wasn't fresh blood, so it didn't really lead anywhere, but it definitely caught the attention of reporter Larry Altman again. He went to Viens' restaurant to follow up on the blood spatter, and that's when Kathy, Viens' new girlfriend, totally lost it. She shoved him out of the restaurant when he brought it up in front of customers. Altman, undeterred, ran with a story suggesting that the cops were closing in on Viens, and that pushed things into overdrive. They even started looking closer at Jackie, suspecting her involvement in sending one of those key texts. Jackie, probably feeling the pressure, warned her dad about Altman's story. Viens, panicking, saw the article and, in a moment of complete breakdown, confessed to Kathy everything. He admitted it was an accident and started talking about how he was thinking of ending it all. In a wild turn of events, he took off with Kathy, and they ended up in a high-speed chase. And the chase ended with Viens driving off a cliff, falling 80 feet, as we told you a while ago. But miraculously, he survived, barely. He had some serious injuries, but the fact that he didn't die was a complete shock to everyone, even Altman. But finally, back on March 2, 2011, nearly a year and a half after Dawn Viens had gone missing, her husband, David Viens, was officially charged with her murder. It all came out after he was found following and attempted to take his own life. The LA County Sheriff's Department got him to a hospital, where, in a police recording, he confessed to being involved in her death. In his confession, David talked about how things had gotten really messy in their relationship. He said their problems were made worse by drugs and alcohol, which took a huge toll on their marriage. Dawn had been battling drug addiction, and her brother mentioned that she'd often ask him to score her some cocaine or meth. David recalled how the night everything went haywire. He said he got home around 12:30 a.m. and Dawn still wasn't there. He figured she was out buying some cocaine, so he tried to get some sleep. He'd been working crazy hours, like 90 a week, but eventually Dawn came back home. She started pounding on their bedroom door, screaming at him. David tried to avoid the fight by telling her to sleep in a different room, but she wasn't having it. She broke down the door and things got heated. She slapped his face and shined a light in his eyes. David kept asking her to leave him alone, but the argument only got worse. Finally, David left the bedroom and followed Dawn into the living room, where he saw her with the cocaine. He grabbed it, threw it in the sink, and that only made her more pissed off. She started swaying and slamming into furniture. To protect himself, David used masking tape to restrain her arms, pinning them to her sides so she couldn't hit him or throw anything at him. But things went out of control, and a physical confrontation started between them. During that, he even put tape over her mouth to quiet her, figuring they'd sort things out in the morning. But when he woke up the next day, Dawn was gone from their bed. He searched the house and found her body cold and stiff nearby. In shock, he realized she was dead. David claimed he never meant for things to go that far. He said his actions, restraining her and leaving the tape on her mouth, had unintentionally led to her death. Panicking, he decided to cover up the whole thing. So he wrapped her body in 3 bags, shoved it in his car, and dumped her in a dumpster. Afterward, he just went on with his life, even promoting Kathy Galvan from hostess to mistress at his restaurant. He seemed oddly detached, almost like his life was over, and started a relationship with Kathy not long after Dawn's death. And after this confession, 19 months went by. David was in a wheelchair and charged with murder. But even after all these, there remained a problem. The investigators had a tough time finding her body. David said he'd thrown it away at his restaurant, but when they tore up floors and broke through concrete, they found nothing. Then, 3 weeks after a fall left him seriously injured, David, heavily medicated in the hospital, reached out to the cops and gave them more details about what happened to Dawn's body. Turns out David hadn't revealed the full story before. The reason? The next part is the real unthinkable and sinister. In a taped conversation with Detective Garcia, he explained how he'd handled her body, while also mentioning the pain he was in from his injuries. Despite David being on meds, Garcia thought he was still clear-headed enough to remember the events. The investigation was still going on, with authorities trying to verify his story and find any trace of Dawn's body. David Viens said he got rid of his wife Dawn's body by boiling it in a massive 55-gallon pot over 4 days. He claimed he put her body face down, filled the pot with water, and let it cook overnight. After the body broke down, he said he bagged up the bigger parts, double-bagged them, and threw them out in the trash, each bag weighing about 8 to 10 pounds. And according to him, this all went down in the kitchen of the restaurant he worked at, a place he knew well from his years in the industry. But later on, Viens changed his story. He said that the confession about boiling his wife's body was all a hallucination, brought on by serious injuries he got when he fell off an 80-foot cliff. But the prosecution didn't buy it. They pointed out that it seemed pretty far-fetched to boil a body in a restaurant kitchen, especially with the space being so tight and the place constantly busy. To test his story, investigators paid a visit to the restaurant, which had been turned into a pizzeria by then. They brought along a 55-gallon drum to see if it would even fit in the kitchen, and they checked out the layout to see if Viens could have pulled it off without anyone noticing. Viens' mom was with them and doubted her son could have done it without being seen, given how visible the kitchen was and how many people worked there. But the prosecution pointed out that what his mom thought didn't really matter in court. They had to go by the facts and Viens' own statements, and the prosecution painted a different picture of what might have happened. They suggested that Viens used a cart to move the big pot through the kitchen, past a narrow door, and then out to a shed where he kept it during working hours. And somehow no one noticed or smelled anything odd, which the prosecution thought was really suspicious. The prosecution made a big deal about David Viens' financial problems when they were laying out their case. They pointed out that Viens had been complaining about missing money from his restaurant, which seemed like a pretty solid reason to believe he might have had a motive to kill his wife, Dawn. They argued that this could have been his way of solving his money issues. So they slapped him with a first-degree murder charge, claiming it was all pre-planned. The trial itself was a 2-week drama, with the main question being whether Dawn's death was an accident or if Viens had done it on purpose. The defense tried to argue it was an accident, saying that Viens had used packing tape to restrain Dawn in the past during fights, and that she was fine afterward. They claimed this wasn't the first time he'd done it, and that her death was just a horrible mistake. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They pointed to his history of domestic violence and argued that this wasn't an accident, it was intentional. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict of second-degree murder, deciding that Viens hadn't planned the whole thing, but still caused her death. Then came the sentencing. In the meantime, David Viens decided to fire his lawyer and represent himself in court. He stuck to his story, saying that the whole thing was a misunderstanding and that the idea of killing his wife over a little stolen money was ridiculous. He swore he loved her and would never hurt her over something so minor. But the judge wasn't convinced. He denied Viens' request for a new trial and sentenced him to 15 years to life in prison. Plus, there was Viens' daughter, Jackie, who played a huge part in everything. She came forward with some key evidence. She revealed that her dad had confessed to the crime. After everything went down, Jackie was torn up inside. She felt guilty and conflicted, wishing she hadn't talked to the police. She couldn't shake the feeling that her choice to speak up was the reason her father ended up where he did. She said she wished things could have turned out differently, realizing how complicated love and grief were in this whole mess. No wonder it was a tough spot for Jackie, as she lost both her parents, and she also had to carry a massive guilt. But what's your opinion on this? Do you think David killed Dawn intentionally, or it was truly an accident? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Now, if you're up for something totally mind-blowing and downright chilling, check out this video about how a divine twist led to a shocking murder no one saw coming. Enjoyed the video? Smash that like button and hit subscribe to stay tuned for more. See you soon.